In 1628, a 9-year-old boy was brought into a courtroom in Würzburg, Germany, and nothing about the scene suggested anything unusual was about to happen. The officials were composed, the procedures familiar, the records prepared in advance. It looked like order. It looked like certainty. By the time he stood before them, the question was no longer what had happened, but whether he would say what was required. He did. Within 3 days, he had given them 14 names. Within a week, he was dead. The documents that remain are precise. A confession entered, a sentence carried out, a line added to a growing record. They do not explain how a child arrives at a confession that fits so perfectly into what is expected. They do not need to. What mattered was not how it began, but that it continued. His name did not end anything. It confirmed that the sequence was working. It made the next name easier to write. What followed across Europe between 1560 and 1660 would take tens of thousands of lives, but the deaths alone do not explain it. The same pattern surfaced again and again, in different towns, under different authorities, producing the same outcomes with quiet consistency. An accusation appeared. An answer was obtained. The answer justified the next step. Each part reinforced the one before it, until the distinction between truth and agreement no longer held. Over time, fewer people resisted, fewer people spoke, and fewer people needed to be persuaded. What remained was something more stable than belief, and more durable than fear, a process that could proceed on its own, requiring only that those within it understood the cost of not participating. And once that cost is understood, it does not need to be enforced. People carry it with them. The witch hunts are often pushed back into the medieval past, placed at a safe distance where they can be explained and dismissed. That distance is part of the mistake. It suggests that what happened belonged to a simpler world, one that no longer exists. It did not. The most intense period unfolded between roughly 1560 and 1660, at the height of what Europe described as renewal. Printing presses multiplied texts faster than they could be contained. Universities expanded. Trade routes did not just connect regions, they carried ideas, rumors, and accusations just as efficiently. Literacy spread. This was not a society that lacked the ability to think. It was a society that could record, argue, and justify, and still burn people in public squares without breaking its own logic. These developments did not oppose each other. They reinforced each other. Martin Luther had already fractured religious authority in 1517. Malleus Maleficarum had been printed in 1486, offering a framework that could be applied wherever suspicion took hold. By the early 1600s, the conditions they helped shape were no longer forming, they were active. The same environment that produced Galileo Galilei and William Shakespeare also sustained public executions as something structured, witnessed, and accepted. This was not a contradiction waiting to be resolved. It was a system that could contain both without strain. Beneath that surface, stability was already failing. The Protestant Reformation did not just divide belief. It divided authority, territory, and allegiance. Catholic and Protestant regions competed for survival in ways that did not allow neutrality. The 30 Years' War did not arrive as a single rupture and then end. It spread, returned, and persisted long enough to reshape entire regions, reducing populations on a scale that altered what normal looked like. War did not resolve pressure. It redistributed it. At the same time, other pressures did not wait. The Black Death never disappeared. It receded and came back in forms that could not be predicted or contained. Smaller outbreaks moved through towns often enough to feel inevitable. Harvests failed in patterns that did not stabilize. The period later named the Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons and reduced yields across entire regions. Food became uncertain. Survival became conditional, then temporary. Political structures did not correct this. They reflected it. Governments fractured. Borders shifted without warning. Local authorities competed with regional powers. while kings depended on alliances that could dissolve without notice. Control was never fixed. Order existed, but only briefly, and never in the same place twice. Conflict did not interrupt daily life. It defined it. For those living inside this, there was no clear beginning, no identifiable end, and no stable point to return to. There was only repetition. Something failed, and then something else did. Loss did not arrive as a single event. It accumulated quietly, until it no longer required surprise. And when instability repeats often enough, it stops being recognized as instability. It becomes the condition everything else must adjust to. And once that shift happens, people stop asking whether something is wrong. They start asking, who is responsible? When things went wrong, they didn't happen once. They repeated. Crops failed, then failed again. Children fell ill and did not recover. Neighbors turned hostile without clear cause. It wasn't a single crisis. It was a pattern that refused to stabilize. People asked why, not out of curiosity, but because nothing else worked. Why this field? Again. Why that family? Why now? And why not someone else? The question stopped being theoretical. It became urgent. The available answers did not hold. Weather explained failure, but offered no control. Disease described death, but gave no direction. Political instability accounted for conflict, but could not prevent it. These explanations were too distant, too impersonal. They told people what had happened, but not what to do next. And when explanation does not lead to action, it begins to feel useless. So another explanation took its place. This one did not remove uncertainty. It redirected it. Misfortune was no longer treated as random or structural. It was treated as intentional, directed, chosen. That shift narrowed the distance between cause and consequence. It brought the source of suffering out of abstraction and placed it within reach. Responsibility no longer belonged to forces. It belonged to someone. By the early 17th century, this belief was not isolated. It was shared across regions already divided by doctrine. After 1517, religious authority fractured, but the idea of an active, present evil did not weaken. It hardened. Protestant and Catholic authorities disagreed on nearly everything that could be argued, but not on this. The devil was not symbolic, not distant. He operated through people, ordinary people, people who looked familiar, spoke the same language, and lived close enough to be named. That belief reorganized perception. Failed harvests were no longer just agricultural. Death was no longer only biological. Conflict was no longer merely political. Each event could now be read as interference, as intent, as the result of someone acting, not something happening. And once that interpretation is accepted, it does more than explain events. It assigns direction to fear. Because if something is causing the damage, then something can be found. And if it can be found, it can be identified. And if it can be identified, it can be removed. That is where the question changes. It is no longer why this is happening. It becomes who. Suspicion did not fall evenly. It followed patterns that repeated across regions, across languages, across courts that never spoke to each other and still arrived at the same conclusions. Certain people were easier to isolate, easier to interpret, easier to turn into answers. Widows without family support stood at the center of that pattern. Women living alone after their husbands died had no protection, no stable position, and no one to absorb attention when it shifted toward them. They were visible in ways others were not. Visibility, in this context, was exposure. Healers who worked with herbs and charms had operated for generations, but what had once been tolerated could be redefined without changing the practice itself. The knowledge stayed the same. The meaning did not. Midwives occupied an even more exposed position. They were present at the moment when outcomes could not be controlled. When births failed, when infants died, when mothers did not survive, they were already there. Presence became implication. Conflicts that had nothing to do with belief did not disappear. They waited. Arguments over land, livestock, or debt remained unresolved, carried forward in memory without closure. When misfortune followed, those memories returned with new weight. A disagreement from years earlier could be reinterpreted as a sign, not coincidence, not tension, evidence. Other markers required even less. Irregular church attendance in a period defined by religious division could be read as distance, and distance suggested risk. Sometimes there was no clear trigger at all. Dislike accumulated quietly through envy, discomfort, small interactions that never resolved until it no longer needed a reason to exist. It only needed direction. Once a name surfaced, it reorganized everything around it. Events that had no connection could be gathered and arranged into a sequence that appeared deliberate. A failed harvest years earlier, dead livestock from the previous winter, a birth that ended badly. Each detail attached itself to the same person, not because it proved anything, but because it removed uncertainty. Fear did not need evidence. It needed coherence. And once a person provides that coherence, the question is no longer whether they are guilty. It is how long it takes before everyone else agrees. In 1486, two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published a book that did not introduce a new fear. It organized one, Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, did not expand belief. It gave it form. Texts about demons and magic had existed for centuries, but they remained scattered, interpretive, uneven. This one was not. It was structured, procedural, and deliberate. It did not ask whether witchcraft might exist. It assumed that it did, and built an operational method around that assumption. It described how witches supposedly functioned, how they were recruited, how they concealed themselves, how they could be identified, and how they should be questioned. It did not leave gaps, and systems without gaps are difficult to challenge. The book spread through mechanisms that did not distort it. Printing presses reproduced it across regions. Courts and churches received versions they could apply without reinterpretation. Between 1486 and 1600, it appeared in 28 editions. It did not remain theory, it became reference. And once something becomes reference, it begins to define what counts as normal. Its arguments were not complex. They did not need to be. Witchcraft was presented as organized and widespread. Not rumor, but conspiracy. Witches were said to hide in plain sight, indistinguishable from anyone else. That meant suspicion could not be contained. It had to remain open, permanent. Denial did not weaken accusation. It confirmed it. An innocent person would deny. So would a guilty one. The difference no longer mattered. Even the body could be read as evidence. Marks, scars, or the absence of pain could be recorded as signs of agreement with something unseen. And then there was the objective, not proof, confession. Everything in the process moved toward it. Accusation triggered investigation. Investigation produced indicators. Denial reinforced suspicion. Interrogation produced admission. Each step confirmed the one before it. The system did not test reality. It replaced it. Once inside that structure, there was no meaningful exit, not because escape was impossible, but because innocence had no function within it. And when a system no longer requires innocence to operate, it does not need to be believed. It only needs to be repeated. Once Malleus Maleficarum established a framework, it did not remain theoretical. Courts across Europe began to mirror it, not through coordination, but through repetition. The same structure appeared in different regions, applied by different authorities, producing the same outcomes. It did not require agreement. It required consistency, and once consistency takes hold, it no longer needs to explain itself. The process moved in steps that did not wait for doubt. First, accusation. It could come from anywhere. A neighbor describing something unusual, a relative recalling behavior that no longer felt harmless, a child repeating words they did not fully understand. Proof was not necessary. Suspicion was enough. Once spoken, it did not need to be true. It only needed to be repeated. Then, arrest. It rarely came with warning. The accused was removed quickly, often at night, before explanation could form or resistance could gather. They were taken away from their home, separated from family, from routine, from anything familiar. Isolation was not incidental. It was functional. It limited assistance, prevented interference, and marked the accused as someone already set apart. By the time anyone asks what happened, the answer has already started to take shape. Then, examination. The body was no longer private. It became material. Marks, scars, moles, irregularities, features that once carried no meaning were reassigned. The search did not aim to understand the body. It aimed to produce significance. Needles might be used to test sensation. A lack of reaction, whether natural or caused by fear, could be recorded as confirmation. The outcome did not depend on what was found. It depended on what could be recorded. These examinations were often witnessed, not hidden, but exposed. The humiliation was deliberate. It did not just affect the accused. It instructed everyone watching how a person could be reduced, redefined, and replaced by a version of themselves that no longer belonged to them. And once that process begins, innocence is no longer a defense. It is simply something the system learns how to ignore. By the late 1600s, the executions slowed and the trials faded. What they built did not. It didn't collapse. It adjusted. It learned how to survive without flames, without crowds, without spectacle. It changed its language, softened its surface, and kept its core intact. Because the structure was never about witches. It was about turning accusation into truth, repetition into proof, and doubt into something dangerous. Once that logic exists, it doesn't stay in one place. It doesn't stay in one century. It waits for the right conditions, and when they return, it moves again. You don't always see it when it starts. You see it later when speaking feels risky, when silence feels safer, when being named becomes more dangerous than being wrong. By then, it's already working.